and welcome to episode 168 of the Board Game Barrage podcast. It's a podcast about board games, the latest hotness, and how to have fun with your friends, even when you're losing. And as always, I'm your host, Dan Hughes, and with me, as always, are my co-hosts, Kellen, Mark, and Neelan. Hello, gentlemen.
Hey.
Hello.
Yes.
Hello.
The most enthusiastic intro ever, I think.
Yeah, well, that's all you're getting from me. From here on, my enthusiasm will wane as I realise what rubbish I'm appearing on.
When you're in the spotlight, you're 100%. When you're a supporting cast member, forget about it.
Yeah, exactly.
Understood.
Dan, we are so grateful to have you on the show. Thank you so much for being here with us.
No, you're welcome.
I feel like I'm supposed to make an Internet Titan joke, but I don't want to.
There's no joking about my Internet Titanness. It's just a fact. It's just a fact.
Just a state of being.
Yeah.
Internet and Kickstarter Titan now.
Well, yes.
Striding both worlds.
Yeah, accidentally on all counts. Accidentally and vaguely reluctantly on all counts, I think.
That's the best way, because if it's on purpose, there's the work you have to put in.
Exactly.
When it's accidental, you sort of just fall into it. Yeah. Wonderful. We have a very Dan episode topic.
I suspect it's been chosen especially for me, as my reputation as the world's grumpiest man has preceded me.
I think so. I think that's accurate.
Yeah.
I sort of thought that's why we'd get along and have like an alliance kind of thing, Dan. But Mr. Delicious and I seem to get along better somehow. So I don't know what that's about.
Probably your personality.
Did he just say he didn't like me then? I think I was just insulted. For a start, you get Richard Simpson on this podcast before me. Richard Simpson!
how low we went.
Talking about scraping the bottom of the barrel. Good grief.
All right.
That is an indictment on the show for sure.
Exactly, yeah.
Today on the Board Game Barrage podcast, we are going to cover why board games suck.
Yeah, and they do.
Full stop.
Admit it, they do.
Well, Dan, I don't know if you know, in America, we have something called the FCC, and there's this thing called the Fairness Doctrine, okay?
Right. No,
is that you have to give equal weight to both sides of a political argument.
Okay.
And this policy was eliminated in 1987.
I wondered what happened. Yeah. I was thinking, that doesn't sound like American media to me, but okay, I'll go with it.
But we are going to apply that to board games today. We have spent 167 episodes telling you why board games are great, and today we're here to tell you why they're not. They do, in fact, suck.
Yeah.
I don't think that's entirely accurate. I don't think we've spent 167 episodes purely
Mark,
positive.
Are you derailing that? We're cutting that. You can't derail that. What are you, Mark?
I'm hoping to derail left and right.
Oh, my God.
That's my raison d'etre. Derail podcasts whenever I can. That's my plan.
We are still going to be nice, right? Polite about this.
No.
So it's just like a straight-on savage attack on board games?
Yes.
It's super offensive.
Absolutely.
Yeah. This is a scorched earth episode.
I don't know how I feel about that.
Neelan, stop.
You're on for the ride.
You already agreed to it. We already hit record.
Yeah.
My number one thing I hate about board games is Neelan.
There you go. You stole mine. I'm going to scramble for a new one now.
Yeah.
The one beacon of positivity on the show.
Yeah.
Dan, the first thing that someone does when they join the Board Game Barrage podcast is they choose a tank color. Have you thought about this?
Sorry, I have to hate to derail again, but that's the second. The first thing is to make fun of Neelan. We've checked that box.
Yeah,
so now we can go to the second. Yeah.
I have. I've had mine saved up for about 4 months, ever since I abandoned board gaming and got briefly into the world of stamp collecting. So my colour tank is Pigeon Blood Pink, which is a official colour, according to the stamp collecting world, of a specific type of stamp, which is a pink colour. So the Pigeon Blood Pink is I'm the Pigeon Blood Pink tank. Thank you very much.
Wow.
Perfect. So I wonder, was there ever coloring with the pigeon blood, or is it pigeon blood is pinker than blood?
I don't know.
You just saw blood and jumped on it. I get it.
It was a pigeon thing that attracted me in the first place.
Okay, it wasn't the blood thing.
No,
it was the pigeon thing.
But the blood thing was just like an added bonus. Yeah.
Yes, understood.
Yeah.
I love the idea that they were just harvesting pigeons to make these stamps.
No, I think that's not correct. But seeing as though hopefully no one else will know, let's just say, yes, that's what they used to do. They used to kill pigeons and make stamps out of them. They used to have a special coop in the Royal Mail headquarters in London.
All right, but before we do that, we're going to talk about the games we have played. Mark is going to talk about Blackout Hong Kong, Neelan about Deckscape, an escape room game, I'm going to cover briefly The Only True and Living Doctor's Royal Visit. And Dan will be talking to us about Marvel Champions. Of course, you would bring a Marvel game to this podcast, as you know how much I love Marvel, I assume.
Well, I don't, because I don't listen to this podcast. But yeah, let's say I do.
Okay. Why don't we start with Mark talking to us about Blackout Hong Kong?
Sure. Blackout Hong Kong is a game I've had my eye on for a while. It was a game I was really excited about when it first came out because it's an Alexander Pfister game, and I'm a big fan of Great Western Trail and Isle of Skye, Oh My Goods, and I really, really enjoyed Maracaibo, which came out after this game. This was a couple years ago, Blackout Hong Kong. But it seemed that Blackout Hong Kong sort of came with a lot of excitement and then went. It seemed not to have that much steam, and it was sort of like out of the board gaming consciousness before you knew it. So that's why I sort of held off. I assumed it was because it was maybe a substandard game. Blackout Hong Kong is a game of... There's a lot of aspects to it. There's an area control. There's a lot of things to it. But the number one thing is the hand management system. Every round in Blackout Hong Kong, you're going to have a hand of cards. You're going to put down a card into 3 or 4 slots on your personal player board, and then you're going to take it in turns to flip those cards over that you've put down and take the actions on the cards. And then once you have 4 cards or less, or 6 cards or less, depending on what you've unlocked during the game, you have the option to take back cards that you've previously played, and that's how you replenish your hand. So you play out 3 cards in 3 separate stacks, and then once you have fewer cards than the threshold, you take back cards from the biggest stack, and that's how you get your cards back, and you play that way. Every time you do this replenishment action, you also have an opportunity to fire off a bunch of bonuses that you've acquired during the game. So there is a reward to doing the replenish sort of action that's sort of interesting. Other than that, it's a pretty straightforward game. You're acquiring resources. You're trying to fulfill these contracts that are on these cards. For most of the cards, when you fulfill the contract, the card now becomes a card that you can play. It goes into your hand, and now you can play it. So that's a way to expand your hand and your options. Some of the contracts become these bonuses that fire off whenever you refresh your hand. So there's a lot of stuff going on. It's actually, for all the mechanisms, for all the things going on, there's even an area control aspect to it. But for all of that, it's actually pretty straightforward. There's not a lot of rules exceptions or overall rules in general. And I was really pleasantly surprised by Blackout Hong Kong. I enjoyed it quite a bit. The way you have to think about the hand management is interesting. It's an interesting take on it because you want to put cards that you want to come back into your hand on the biggest stack because the biggest stack is the one that comes back to your hand quickest. But there's some reason why you might not want to do that because you also can get bonuses for having certain colors in certain stacks. So there's a lot to think about, but you're not sort of like buried by the rules. So I really enjoyed Blackout Hong Kong. Have any of you guys played Blackout Hong Kong?
I haven't, no. I do like the way it looks, and actually one of the things that was interesting to me about it was I remember thinking that Maracaibo was the first time that Pfister had done this campaign structure with, I guess there was like some follow-on, but I guess Blackout Hong Kong is actually the originator of that for him.
Yeah, I don't know anything about how good the campaign is,
Yeah.
but it just feels to me probably tacked on. I mean, I guess if you're playing solo or something, then maybe you'd want that, but it's not anything that even registers to me.
I get that, because honestly, that's how I've felt about all of them so far.
Yeah.
Like, Cloud Age was like, this was not needed at all, but I'm pleased to hear that the base game is something you enjoyed.
Yeah.
I've played it. I thought it was really, really good. It's a real brain burn. It really made me plan ahead and things like that. I came very, very last in it, I seem to remember. But I was the only person who hadn't played it before. I think the reason it didn't do it very well was, although I like the way that it looks as well, was that in fact it's just a black board.
Yeah.
And I think it just didn't appeal to people visually.
I can see that.
It looks like when you accidentally print something and then you're really upset that you've wasted all of your printer ink.
I do think like the points of color on it though make it look pretty striking. Personally, I don't know.
It's very functional and it works well for the theme. It's just it was perhaps a misplaced theme.
Yeah,
I think.
Sure.
I can see that.
Yeah, agreed.
They must have overprinted the ever-living out of this game, because when I see these sales for like big box games and you're getting Blackout Hong Kong for $20,
Yeah.
I'm like, wow, these are sitting in a warehouse somewhere. How interactive is it, Mark? Do you think? I like Mr. Pfister's games, but I'm just not sure, so I feel like there'd need to be some substantive interaction for me to really want to jump into this.
Then you probably don't want to jump into this. The interaction is only from, there is a part of every round of the game where you are buying these objective cards that you're trying to fulfill, these contracts basically that you're trying to fulfill. That's really the only interaction. There's also a area majority, and There is a bonus for being the first person to encircle a spot on the board, but even then, everybody's scoring. So there's a little bit of a race to encircle things, but even if you don't fully encircle first, you'll still get a bunch of points. So the interaction is fairly low.
It is. I remember being angry at the other players, though, so there must have been some interaction.
Yeah, the part of the game where you get the most angriest at other players, I think, is this whole encircling thing. Because if you encircle any region on the board, you get to put one of your houses down, and that's a new bonus that you get every time you refresh your hand. So that's the thing that you want to sort of jump on. And that was Blackout Hong Kong by Alexander Pfister.
Mark, why don't you at least try to keep up with the show Bible? We call him Mr. Pfister.
I don't go for all that stuff.
You don't believe in that.
I've never once said the slogan. Dan has said the slogan of the show. I have yet to say the slogan. So they've indoctrinated you, Dan, and I've yet to fall for it.
Well, I don't mind being indoctrinated.
I will jump in. I had a chance to play Royal Visit with Christina, which is a new re-release of a Reiner Knizia, The Only True and Living Doctor, his game Times Square. It is a 2-player hand management game where you're trying to get one piece to one end of the board. So if you imagine the board is just a long lengthwise, it comes towards you and it goes away from you, and that's it. It's a tug of war where basically you're trying to move the king into your court, and then you immediately win the game. But what's interesting is that the king piece has to stay between two other pieces, the guards. And so in order to move the king, you must move the guards first. And then if you move sort of the back guard closer towards you, you're reducing the spaces that they can move the king the other way. And the way that you move these pieces is with pretty straightforward hand play, where it's like, okay, I have 3 guard cards, so I'm going to move this guard that space, this guard that. You can play as many cards as you want of one type, and then screw around with them on the board. There is a wizard piece and a joker piece that have special powers that sort of allow you to screw around. This is a new re-release from Yellow, and the production is amazing. Really, really amazing. Beautiful cloth board, really nice wood pieces. The art on the cards is incredible. I like the game. I imagine that people will be a little annoyed because the entire game is just like, I move the king 2 this way. I move the king 2 that way. I move the guard 3 that way. And it's sort of like this back and forth where it feels like you're not making meaningful progress until someone goes ba-bam, ba-bam with the cards and then combos the king really far and really close to you. And then someone's like, I used the wizard, and that moves the king 8 spaces back. Christina really adored this. I really enjoyed it and think the production is like, wow. I want to play it more. I don't want to give my hot take. I know I just did give my hot take. Mark, I imagine you may have tried Times Square, but maybe
I have not.
Okay.
I've seen it around for a long time, and I've heard a little bit about it, but no, I've never played it.
Dan?
I do like Knizia a lot, but I've never even heard of this one. It sounds a little bit like Onitama, although probably nothing like Onitama.
Yeah, I can see that. I don't know if I'm describing this well. It's like there are like 15 spaces, and it's like you either go this way or that way, and you're just moving forward or backward.
It's like a tug-of-war thing. Yeah,
it's like literally all in the same place. But I guess the old theme, Times Square, was about getting
gangsters,
Saucy Sue was moving with her bodyguards. Dear Lord. And Handsome Hal was attracting people with his charm.
That's what happens when you let Knizia come up with a theme.
Well, they have really upgraded the theme here. I just bought this on Amazon on a lark for $20 and am very pleased with it. I'm a little bit like, maybe I'd rather just play Throne and Grail, but that's an obscure Japanese card game that you can't buy. Christina was immediately like, this is better than that. And I'm like, I don't know. I am excited to play it more, though, and I immediately thought, I need to play this with Mark. I need to play this with Neelan. I didn't immediately think I need to play this with Dan. So sorry about that.
That'd be quite expensive, to be fair, for one of us.
I do like the idea now that this is the second recent Knizia 2-player game that you've spoken about, Kellen, where like Lord of the Rings Confrontation being a much more expensive thing to try to get hold of these days. But the idea of like a $20 solid Knizia 2-player design is very, very appealing, especially one that comes in as attractive a package as this one does.
Totally. And I think my 2-player gaming has gone up as you guys have, declined to hang out with me more and more over the last year.
All right. Well, so I feel less guilty about that then. So great.
That is Royal Visit by The Only True and Living Doctor.
Well, I've been playing Marvel Champions because in the UK, well, in my part of the UK, we've been locked down for about a year. So I've not been able to go out and game with grown-ups. I've been doing a lot of kids gaming. But the game that I've spent a lot of time on recently is playing solo games of Marvel Champions, which is kind of evolvation. Is that a word?
Yeah, that's
evolution.
Yes.
An evolution of Arkham Horror, which in itself is an evolution of the Lord of the Rings living card game. And I really, really enjoy it. I would say it's a solo or cooperative game where you're playing a hero against a villain. And the thing I really like about it is there's no deck building. There can be deck building if you want to do deck building, but each pack of a hero pack is its own deck. You don't need to move anything around. You don't need to shuffle it or anything, so you can just play it. And I hate deck building with a passion because whenever I get a deck and try and build it, I make it infinitely worse, which is my problem with Arkham Horror. Arkham Horror is much better for a storyline. It's got wonderful ways of kind of weaving plot and things like that throughout the game, but you progress in that and you have to change the deck. And every time I change a deck, I end up making it absolutely shocking. By the end of a campaign, I've got this completely useless character who basically got all the really powerful cards because that's how shallow I am, but can't actually pay to play any of them. So Marvel Champion hasn't got the plot for it, but what it does have is some incredibly clever design where each deck you play feels very different to the other one. So Iron Man feels incredibly different to, say, Ms. Marvel. Each hero plays very, very different, and you have to kind of get to know the way they play. I've really been enjoying it. I've got a little chart where I can chart where my wins and losses against various villains and things like that. So Marvel Champions, I really like it. And it's very expensive if you look at it as a whole, but because they kind of get you kind of with £15 packs here and there, it doesn't feel like you're being ripped off, which I am.
Is this the one? Is this the one where you can play both sides of a superhero's, like his alter ego and his?
Yeah. So the villain has got a dastardly scheme that you got to try and stop, but also you stop him by beating him up. But you also got to kind of thwart his scheme, and you can kind of take rests by flipping into your alter ego. But then the villain starts scheming away while you're not trying to stop him and stuff. It's incredible how Fantasy Flight do such thematic games just with cards.
Right.
Arkham Horror, I think, is the pinnacle of that because they managed to put a plot in there as well. But this still plays like, in contrast to like Marvel Legendary, where it's just a deck builder with superhero pictures on the front. This feels like well, it doesn't feel like it at all, let's face it. It feels like you're playing a card game, but you can see where the links are thematically, is what I'm saying.
You've liked this a lot at solo, because I feel like the thing that's put me off Arkham Horror for the longest time was feeling like it was shining best as a two-player game, but you feel like this is really, really solid as a solo?
Yeah. The problem with Arkham Horror is you need to play it two-handed to be able to have even a cat's chance in hell. So you're managing two different characters at the same time, which you can do, but it's a pain. With Marvel Champions, you can play one-handed, and it's absolutely fine.
That's awesome, because I think a lot of what you said has kind of really spoken to me, because I have the same sort of... I used to love deck-building games, but I just never feel like I have the time or the will to modify them as much. And I think for something like a campaign like Arkham Horror, I could get into that, but I love the idea of just picking up a deck and playing it, and every hero being a new one of those that I can try out. That sounds great to me.
And if you want to get into the deck building, you can, but
sure.
I don't, so I don't.
And the idea that each deck feels analogous to the heroes is very appealing. Like, for some reason, when I look at the Marvel Champions box, the thing that I'm hoping for is the idea that, you know, if I'm playing the Spider-Man deck, that it feels different. It feels Spider-Man-like, quote-unquote. And then if I play like the She-Hulk deck, it's a different sort of thing. That feels very appealing to me. And it looks like they say the playtime, I don't know how accurate this is 45 to 90 minutes. Does that seem pretty good, pretty accurate?
I would say it's shorter than that. I would say
that's great.
30 minutes to 45 minutes.
See, that feels very appealing. That sounds very fun.
It's worth getting because you can always sell it again.
Yeah.
It costs a lot over time if you want, and it will cost a lot to get everything that's been out. But as I've been in it since the beginning, it's not really registered.
Well, I'm going to just wait for somebody who has bought it and bought all the expansions to get sick of it, and then I will swoop in and get it. Yeah.
What do you think is missing from my humanity that, like, none of this sounds good at all?
Well, I think it could be your intense vitriol for Marvel, for one thing.
Excuse me, sir?
The idea of, like, playing as different superheroes doesn't appeal to you?
Well, I mean, I guess it's a co-op, right? So you're playing against sort of like
Well, this feels
random.
like a co-op that is basically a solo game that you can add more players to. Is there a big difference between the co-op and the solo aspect of this?
There is to an extent. Some heroes are better when working with others.
I see.
Oh, that's cool.
Thor, for example, is pretty useless on his own because he's all about bashing up minions and things, whereas you can't take on the big villain, so you need somebody else to do that for you. But they're all playable on their own. Scarlet Witch and Quicksilver, they work off each other because they're brother and sister, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah.
But I don't like playing it multiplayer, although I do play it sometimes with my oldest son multiplayer. But I like it as a solo game. It's a relaxing solo game for me. If you don't like superheroes, then you're not going to like it. You'd be better off with Arkham Horror.
I played Sentinels of the Multiverse, and it was just sort of like, okay, yeah, we're all co-oping this thing. And then, like, if you apply that concept to, like, PvP, right, you'd get, like, Guards of Atlantis, which I love, right? Everyone has a unique hero, a unique way to interact. We're MOBAing, right? But the idea that, oh, I want to feel like Spider-Man, it's like, okay, I'll play a video game, like that quickness or that web slinging. Like, when you're playing a card game, it's like, what do you mean it feels different? Like, oh, this character plays 3 more cards than that character and does 7 damage instead of 2 cards that do 2 damage. Like, what?
The easiest example would be, if you take Iron Man, you've got to build up his suit. It's a process to get all these things in place. And then when you have built the suit, you're super powerful. And you do some massive damage and things like that. Whereas the Scarlet Witch is all about chaos, and so various things kind of are quite random and things like that, but can be really powerful, but can also kind of screw you over a little bit. Where the Hulk is just about smashing somebody for damage, but the villain could be scheming away in the corner and win the game, because if he survives long enough, then he's going to win the game by his evil plan coming to fruition and stuff like that. Honestly, the cards do play very different, just like the black deck of Magic will play different to a blue deck of Magic, for example.
Right.
That kind of thing. It's not just play more 3 cards, but you've got to have a level of willingness to be, with all these themes, you've got to have a level of willingness to lose yourself in them. And it isn't as much like being Spider-Man as playing the Spider-Man PS4 game, because there's very few things that are better than that, to be honest. But it's a nice puzzle, it's an enjoyable game, and as I say, nice and quick. I get it out, don't have to deck build, slap it on table, play it, just a good solo game.
Yeah, the art is really cool, for sure. I think the cover is very, very nice.
And that's Marvel Champions.
So I've been playing very quick little, speaking of solo games, a very quick little, not necessarily solo, but cooperative puzzle game called Deckscape. In particular, the one I played is called Deckscape Test Time. And I've spoken before about my love of these sort of escape the room style puzzle games. Exit is the one I will frequently laud as being my favorite. Deckscape skews a little bit closer to Unlock, if you're familiar with that, which is basically to say that it is almost entirely made up of just a deck of cards. When a game of Deckscape starts, all of the cards are in a very specific order. You reveal the top one, and it will say, reveal the next one. And now you have a little layout of the location you're looking at. Then reveal the next one, and there will be some sort of puzzle area that you may not have everything you need to solve yet. And you're sort of revealing the cards in order until you get to sort of natural stopping points, at which point you have a few little puzzle areas in front of you, maybe an item you can pick up. And the idea is, when you have an appropriate item and you feel like you now have the means to solve a specific puzzle as represented on that card, you just flip the card over. It will say, oh, if you have this item and you got this answer, congratulations, move on to the next card in this stack. Or, failing that, you get a bad check mark and record this for your score at the end of the game. And the whole game is that. It's just progressing through this deck of cards by looking at the art on a card, which will either give you clues to art on another card, or finding a sort of a hidden item in the corner of a location, which will be the item you need to open a locked door, for example. So this is the second of these Deckscape games I've played, and in all honesty, I'm not a huge fan of them. I feel like the appeal of them off the bat is that they're cheap, they're small, they're very simple, and they're quick. Like, even for me as a solo player, I can get through one of these in about half an hour. But what they make up in that sort of very low barrier to entry, they kind of also just feel a lot more disposable, which is ironic considering that it's a game that you can reuse and give to someone, and the actual disposable version of this, Exit, always feels that much more memorable to me. The premise of the Exit games is that they're single use, but they're much more inventive with their mechanics and with their puzzles, and I kind of feel like I come away from the Deckscape and the Unlock series kind of just feeling a little bit underwhelmed, like the puzzles were a little bit too basic. Even as a solo player, I kind of feel like either a puzzle is pretty obvious on its surface or is so obscure as so I would never have gotten there. And often I just flip over a card, see the solution, I'm like, okay, that's absurd, and then I'm just on to the next card. It just has that sort of like ephemeral nature to it, where I just don't care about the proceedings as much, and that's unfortunate. I will absolutely give them credit for being a game that you just stack back in order and you can pass on to someone else. That's great. Exit sort of, to some extent, has a lot to answer for its single-use nature, but definitely not my favorite in this genre, unfortunately. I'm not sure that I'm going to be playing many more Deckscape games.
It's funny, because the thing that surprised me the most, or I guess the earliest from your discussion of this, is the fact you're saying this is the second one you've played. Because honestly, I played Fate of London, and it was completely, like you said, ephemeral. I played it, don't remember a single thing about it. The only reason I know I played it is because I've logged the play. But other than that, it could have never happened. And so I don't know why, having played one of these games, probably London, right? It was probably the same.
I think it was. Maybe it wasn't the same session as you. It could well have been.
Who knows? And see, the fact you can't remember. So why? I don't understand why you'd even play a second one of these.
So
it's totally fine, but it's nothing.
Well, I agree with you, but here's the thing that I think is maybe a big factor in this: that it's long enough ago, and I didn't remember it enough that when I saw this come up in the math trade, it's yeah, I'll grab one of those. It was just kind of this passing thought, but it probably says a lot that I don't really remember having played Fate of London either. I feel like I'm always in the market for a small puzzle game, right? And especially if I can get one in the context of a math trade where I'm getting it for an extremely low value trade, for example, then yeah, I'll happily grab that. 2 years from now, I might do the same thing again for a Deckscape, because I've already forgotten how much I dislike them. But I guess I'm going to use this as another opportunity to say, if you like the idea of what I've described, these sort of puzzle escape the room games, and you've not played an exit game before, check those out. They're fantastic.
My highest praise for the Deckscape games, and this is genuine, is that there are things you could be doing with 60 minutes that are worse for you. Literally, it's complete pastime. Don't go in expecting anything fantastic, and it's like a puzzle. It is a puzzle. It is, in fact, the definition of a puzzle, and you can put that on the box.
A puzzle. A Board Game Barrage review.
Yeah, exactly. Deckscape, test time. Board Game Barrage review, it's a puzzle.
That was Deckscape Test Time.
What a terrible subtitle, too. Test time.
The way I pronounce that makes it sound weirder than it's test time, as in it's time for a test, presumably?
Oh, is that what it is?
Maybe.
It's literally like what a teacher would say to a student. It's
test time.
Say, test time. I think so. Maybe.
God, that's boring, too. The whole thing is boring.
And now for our feature topic. And that topic is why board games suck. I'm hoping for an alliance here with Mr. Dan Hughes for all the reasons that we hate board gaming. This could be big, this could be small, but we're here to talk about it. 167 episodes of positivity, followed by one to align with the FCC's fairness doctrine, to provide airtime to discuss controversial matters of public interest and air contrasting views regarding those matters. And in this case, those matters are board games. Who wants to kick us off and tell us a reason that board games suck?
I can start.
Do it.
When it comes to board games, as I've said on the show, I'm fine playing long games. Totally fine with long games. I'm fine with games that have a lot of rules, too. That's fine, especially when it comes to long games. I guess exclusively when it comes to long games. Like, if it's a short game, I don't want to deal with a lot of rules. But I'm happy to go for a lot of rules when it comes to longer games. What I don't like, what is really annoying for me, especially now that I guess I hold my time to a greater regard than maybe I did in the past, is games that have long rule books with a lot of exceptions. I can deal with a lot of rules, that's fine, but don't make me remember, in addition to all these rules, a lot of exceptions. But in this case, that doesn't apply. Or, this troop will work against all these guys, but it doesn't work against this person. The game that recently I stumbled upon this issue with, to the extent where I didn't even play it, was Gandhi. Gandhi is a coin game that just came out, and I like coin games. I love historically themed games. This game is chock full of historical themes and a part of history that I'm not super familiar with. And so I was excited to try it out, and it's a soloable game. I've warming up a little bit to playing solo games, and especially this is a game where I'm happy to play solo because of the length of time, and I don't expect a ton of people to be interested in a long solo game about Gandhi. But in reading the rule book, it was just full of exceptions and certain areas of the map where things can't happen and certain troops that react differently in one situation or another, and it just sort of put me off to the point where I decided I'm not going to deal with it. I'm not going to deal with having to remember all these exceptions. With a lot of coin games, there are flow charts, and that's fine, but this just had exceptions to the charts, and I just couldn't do it. It made me think of another game in the past that has the same sort of issue for me, not to the same extent, but Robinson Crusoe is a game with a lot of exceptions, and it's one of the reasons why, it's one of a number of reasons, to be frank, that I'm not a big fan of Robinson Crusoe. But just I'll swallow all of the rules, fine, but just if there could be some level of streamlines, if you could just have a rule apply to all aspects of the game, I'd be much happier. I can't deal with exceptions in rulebooks.
I think this linked in quite strongly with mine, so I'm going to piggyback off you if that's okay.
Yeah.
Because I agree with you, exceptions and things, but my feeling is that there's a movement within board gaming at the moment, not universally within board gaming, but certainly a movement, in that if the rules aren't convoluted and complicated and the very opposite of elegant, the very opposite of a Knizia game, for example, then it's not a proper board game. The game that springs to mind instantly, and it's unfair because it actually is quite a good game, is Lisboa. Lisboa is a game where each player needs to be given their own rule book in order to play it. And literally you get a rule book. Each player gets a rule book. And there's tracks here and there's tracks there, and that track affects this track. And it's games I call the kitchen sink. Everything the designer has thought of is thrown in there and probably added more and more complexity and things like that. Now, there is a market for those kind of games, and some people love those kind of games, and that's absolutely fine. But there's an overwhelming kind of, attitude.
Yeah, I agree.
Amongst a lot of gamers that they are the only games that really count. As a very strong family gamer, obviously, I'm very much against that. But even as a Euro gamer, the heavy Euros, they're a niche within a niche. They're not the end goal. They're not what we're all trying to strive for. You start off with Splendor, then you go to Stone Age, and then you go to whatever, and eventually one day you may be able to play Lisboa, and then my son, you will be a real board gamer.
Right.
And Lisboa is a very unfair example of this, because Lisboa actually is very thematic as well, and it actually makes logical sense. So I'm being unfair to Lisboa here. But there are a number of very heavy board games. Feast for Odin is another one. You're thinking, do we need all this? Do we really need all this? Could you not have just reduced this a little bit and boiled it down to what makes the game fun, not what makes the game look impressive and an impressive one around you that you're good at it. So everything in the kitchen sinkness of board gaming really boils my goat. If that's a phrase,
I am forced to contend you on A Feast for Odin as my favorite board game, but I will absolutely agree with you on the spirit of this, which is there is, I think, this very intense idea that a heavier game is a better game. That if you sort of start with one point and you sort of have the version of it that is the slightly heavier, slightly thinkier version of that, then that is the better version of that game. And I contend everything about that notion. And in some ways, like, we have in the past described gateway games and that sort of thing. And I think you're right, Dan. And that is a somewhat of a unhelpful label because it implies this progression, like you said. And I don't think that complexity should be the end goal. And we've spoken a lot on the podcast about, at least Callan and I have, about the Lacerda problem sometimes, where it's complexity for complexity's sake. And yeah, it gets my grill up equally.
Yeah.
Well, Neelan and I, constantly talk about this, and I rail against Lacerda, to the point that another podcast recently labeled me as a party gamer. And that was what I was espousing. And I felt like that was kind of indicative. Like, if you look at my top 50, there are definitely 5 to 10 party games on it, but I have Trois, Diplomacy, Innovation, and Cthulhu Wars in my top 10, so it's clear that I like all sorts of games. This actually dovetails again. We'll just keep dovetailing off of each other. One of my biggest problems with board games and the board game hobby is that I think that we have it backwards in terms of that we think that the hobby thinks that the board games themselves are more intellectually stimulating than the people that they are playing them with. And so what this means for me is there are huge rule sets, right? Which we've talked about. These huge rule sets often have huge walls around our ability to interact with the other players. So there's layers and layers of complication that in some ways, ironically, as the complication of the board game expands, literally the table size and all the that you have on the table expands. You are physically moving people further and further away from each other because there's just so much stuff, right? So in my mind, it should be the people first, right? Then the play, the interaction that the game allows between those players. And then the third thing is the intellectual puzzle that the game itself offers. And I would say that the hobby itself actually literally flip-flops it and says, no, the people aren't what's important here. The intellectual puzzle is the most important. Then the way you interact, and then we'll get to the people at some point, which to me feels like a bastardization of the entire premise of board gaming.
I think you're right. I think it's interesting. I think the problem there is there's two different types of gamers. If you look at a solo gamer who prefers solo games is there purely for the intellectual puzzle. And as Ben Maddox describes it, the other people are just sacks of meat sitting around the table there in order to kind of provide free AI in order to play against. And, that's fine if that's how you want to play.
Sure.
And I've often said that board games are a wonderful catalyst for people who find social interaction quite difficult because there is something to focus on instead of awkward silence. So the games that you and I, the lighter games or the more interactive games or whatever, Kellen, that I prefer, because I want to spend time with people I like in a board game. And if I'm not hooting and hollering and swearing and calling people all names of the sun and getting angry and mock outrage, I'm not having a good time. Whereas other people find that me being on the table opposite them very obnoxious. So I think it just depends on what kind of things you're in. But I think there is a thing in board gaming about people not recognising that all games have merit, as you say, and it's this big progression thing. I mean, Speaking as a game designer, because I'm a game designer now, guys, speaking as a game designer, it's a lot harder to simplify your game down and boil it down than it is to add loads and loads of different nuts and bolts on. Because in order to solve a problem, it's a lot easier to solve a problem by going, oh, well, we'll just have this rule. Instead of going, okay, no, we're going to have to boil things right down and make it as simple. And I mean, I was designing a kids' game, so I have to make it as simple as absolutely possible. And it'd been a lot easier to add on 7 tracks and do all that stuff. So a heavy design, I'm going back to my point because obviously my point's most important. A heavy design isn't indicative of a great design, which is why Knizia is the king.
I remember Shut Up and Sit Down started this whole series on folklore, games.
Folk games, yeah.
And I was like, this is boring. I don't want to listen to this. And I've come around on it a little bit, right? Because the premise of this for me is, we're all at a table laughing, or we're all at a table like learning about each other through little games, Imagine if, Mark, Neelan, and I and Christina got together at a park and played an absolutely stupid game. What is it? The Phantom Toll Booth?
Death by Trolley.
Death by Trolley, which is like, who would you murder, this track or this track? And it's like God or, like you have a bunch of Bitcoin and you have to like just roll the trolley into one of them. And it was stupid. It's a stupid game. Mark was setting it up and I said, this is stupid. Why are we doing this? And then 10 minutes in, it was probably the most fun thing we did because it was just us having a goof and saying, would you rather murder puppies or children? And that got right to the heart of the differences between Neelan and I.
You said both, didn't you?
Can we somehow split
How
this
do we
thing?
join these rails together?
Yeah. Let's move the puppies onto the rail with kids on. That's 2 birds with 1 stone.
I will say that I think that for me, when I hear your issue, Kellen, it feels to me, and maybe this is not fair, it feels to me like more a problem with the gamers than the game. Like, I enjoy heavy games, but I can think of a number of heavy games that I've played, multiple hour games, even 18xx games that I've played, where there's a lot of joking at the table. And there's a lot of like interaction.
Yes.
It may not facilitate those type of interactions. Whereas like a lighter game where you don't have to keep the rules in your head, you have more bandwidth, for lack of a better term, to talk and joke and stuff like that. But I think you can make any game interactive if you have good friends.
Yeah, and it depends on the group, doesn't it? It depends on the group, and it depends on what that person wants out of the game as well. I mean, it's a shut up and sit down thing again. Is that shut up and sit down, love all these party games because they have a massive group of really talented storytellers and things like that to play with. Whereas if I sat down with some of the people in my game group and did that, we'd all be just kind of staring at each other and it'd be incredibly dull time. So everyone can't have a popping group, which is all kind of sparky and creative and things like that.
Yes. I'm not opposed, Mark, to that pushback. And even another bullet I had that we'll probably not get to for time is that the games are so group dependent, right? You have to find the right group in order to unlock the power of board gaming, which is why Board Game Barrage is so successful, because we're all such brilliant minds and love spending time with each other. I still think that the hobby is pushing in that direction, or that the more time you spend in the hobby, the more you push that way. And I agree there are niches where that is not the case. So it's hard if your counter argument, Mark, is, but what about this board game? We could go down that rabbit hole and I could find counter arguments to your counter argument.
Do you feel the board game hobby is pushing in that direction? Or do you feel the people who talk about board games online are pushing in that direction? Because that's the other thing. There's two very different groups. Board games like an iceberg. You've got all the people on Board Game Geek and Facebook and Twitter at the very top of the iceberg, and you've got the people who actually play the games in this big mass. But they might only play every month, but they're a huge, massive iceberg underneath it.
Yeah. That's interesting. Those who are very vocal or very engaged in the hobby push for the heavier Euro type experiences. I don't know. Yeah, I think that's fair, Mark. But this episode is why board games suck. So why are you derailing the topic, sir?
Well, I told you I was here to derail.
Yeah.
That's what I'm here for.
I actually think that all of this kind of dovetails. I mean, if we're dovetailing after dovetailing, why not keep going?
We've got dovetails and pigeon blood.
Yeah, exactly. So this segues pretty nicely into sort of one of my broader, and it's a pretty broad point, so I'm going to sort of try not to get too scattered with it, but I do think that board games as a whole don't respect user experience a lot. And I think it's kind of something you were saying, Dan, struck me in terms of the design of CoraQuest, where there is this temptation, and I think a lot of board games do, of okay, we're going to layer on rules, we're going to layer on complexity, but you are ultimately making that game harder to internalize. You're making it less accessible. And something you were saying about the rule books is also striking in this case, Mark, because I feel like one of the things that we have a basic expectation from consumer devices and video games is this idea is that you will be able to jump in and be able to figure out the systems as you go. But when you buy a board game, you're suddenly burdened with so much required effort on the part of normally one person, whether it's punching, sorting, setting up, learning rules, having rules that are hard to reference, having complexities that don't need to be there, where ultimately what we should be aiming for a good board game experience is something that you can sort of just sit down, break up, and experience the joy of playing something with a group of people, right? In some ways, I sometimes feel like a good board game gets out of the way of itself. And this is something that Kellen has said a lot, and sort of gets you to the heart of what the interaction is, even what the heart of a mechanic is. And anytime you're laboring over a rule book, or squinting at the other end of a board, or deciphering iconography, you're creating a barrier for any number of people. And I think board games as a whole, whether it's accessibility stuff, colorblindness stuff, rule stuff, component stuff, could be so much better at creating an out-of-the-box experience. I feel like I'm crazy because I feel like so many other products, like video games, like electronics, this is required. If you don't do this, you will fail as a product, and somehow board games get away with it. You can just have the heaviest, most unwieldy thing, and someone will still love it and laud it as the best thing that's ever been made.
Sort of ties together with what Dan said, the idea that there is an idea that heavier games, more complicated games are closer to the true or the better experience, and therefore there's more willingness to take on that effort in the upfront.
Neelan, I think about, and I was thinking about this in the shower.
As all best ideas.
Yes.
I was thinking about you in the shower as well. I mean, you being in the shower.
I think about video games, right? And every time I want to show Christina a video game, the controller is the barrier.
Yeah.
Okay, because these controllers, you've got 17 analog sticks, L1 through L5 going on, and, pressure sensitivity. And the modern video gamer, that's, it's boom, they know it, right? And we have some analogous in board games with terms and structure that I can just grok a rule book way better now than I could a couple of years ago. And so I think about those things, and I don't know that I have a point, but even the tutorials in video games, right, where it's the game just starts. A mobile phone game now, you load into the game, and it has you playing in 2 clicks.
Right.
Because they know you're out otherwise. And there are many games that I think have tried to tutorialize.
This War of Mine, I think, Tainted Grail, I mean, the couple of games from Awakened Realms have this idea that, like, literally the first thing you see is read this first, set this up, and we will teach you how to play the game and even get you into your first scenario, like, immediately. And I love
cool.
that. I love that.
And the Friedman Friesa, the Fable series.
Yeah, that's a great example.
You just dive right in. Yeah.
My other main point, which dovetails off of the Pigeon, I don't even know what's happening anymore. What your Pigeon Blood Pink Tank?
Yeah.
What do you think that's
Look
gonna?
it up.
You think that's gonna go nice on a T-shirt, Dan? I don't.
All the kids will be talking about it in the playground tomorrow.
Yeah.
Trust me.
Okay. I believe that the board game ratio of time investment is bad. Okay. So let's define some terms. Okay. In the board game hobby, there is non-game playing time, which we can refer to as NGPT.
Great. I love this already.
And then there is game playing time, which we can refer to as GPT. The ratio of NGPT to GPT is skewed too much towards...
Hold on. I need to get another eraser. Sorry, my eraser I ran out of...
Okay.
Yeah, hold on one second.
Yeah.
I'll be right back.
So let's define NGBT now that we've set the hypothesis. Researching what type of games you might be interested in playing, buying them, organizing them, punching them out, learning how to play, rule books, tutorial videos to make sure you get it, the setup and teardown of the game all add up to more time than playing the game. And so for me, in comparison to other hobbies, like running, playing soccer, physical exercise, many other hobbies, the ratio of NGPT to GPT is much more favored towards the doing than the researching, in my opinion. How do you respond, good sirs?
I think the researching and the buying of games is a completely separate hobby to the actual playing of games. Roughly 2 years ago, I stopped buying board games, so I stopped listening to a lot of podcasts, I stopped watching a lot of YouTube things. I still was playing other people's board games, and I was very popular for doing it, because they've all bought these board games and they need someone to play it with. So I was a courted leech who could come round to people's houses and play their games that they're desperate to get off their shelves and stuff like that. So I think it's a separate hobby. The thing with soccer, people who play soccer, they spend a lot of time doing it. A lot of people watch soccer and research soccer and think about soccer and have podcasts about soccer without ever going to a soccer field. So I think you're right. I think if you want to play games and if that's your passion, then there is a very much disparity between how much time you spend on the internet making podcasts about board games to how much time you actually spend playing board games. And that's certainly where I am, even though I don't buy them anymore. So yeah, I think they're two separate hobbies. Don't necessarily even cross over. I know lots of people who buy a lot of board games but never play any.
I think it's all part of the joy people who are deep into the hobby get. I think any hobby, whatever the hobby is, whatever the actual thing that you do, like in this case board games, actually playing the games, that's just one aspect of it. I think there is something inherently enjoyable to somebody who's so deep into a hobby, researching it and, then finding the perfect shelving to put things in and reading the rule books and setting up, obviously
Mark.
All these things can be a pain,
Mark.
but
please.
you just have no passion, Kevin.
Okay.
You're passionless.
Let's stop for a moment and just
Okay.
make sure we're on the same wavelength.
Yes.
Your supposition here, I don't even know what a supposition is that NGPT is as good as GPT.
I think that when you're deep into a hobby, you will...
Sir,
it's natural
can you
to
answer
derive
the
enjoyment
question?
from all these ancillary things.
No, you're right, Kelland. It's ultimately unsatisfying, is the GPDP, or whatever you were talking about. The researching and the talking and the thing is nowhere near as satisfying as the playing. You're completely right. And one of the problems with setting your identity as your hobby is that you get so much into the PSD or whatever it was, and then not into the DIY. That it becomes... yeah.
See, I disagree. I think making this argument is going against human nature. I think you guys are right that, yes, ideally you wouldn't care about this stuff and you would just care about playing the games. But I think that you're just asking people to not be people in that case. I think
would like
this
it
is
if people
how
were
people
people.
are.
Yes.
That's true. That's a very good point. But I just think that is just kit and caboodle with what human nature is. It's human nature to collect. It's human nature to classify. It's human nature to do all these things. And to say that, yes, ideally you wouldn't do that is fine. Let's talk about utopia. Let's talk about some theoretical thing that doesn't matter. I think in practice, people enjoy this kind of stuff. It's completely fair to say there are people, like a lot of people go overboard. Sure, I agree with you 100%. But I think to say this is like, even to say it's bad, you don't have to go so far as to say it's wrong. Even to say it's bad, I think it's just not fair to like the human condition. I just think people, this is what people are. Honestly, I just think it's like hard.
So, okay, we've got a lot here. Collections, I would love to break down. And even though I have, Pokemon cards encased in acrylic right here next to me. But what about just the smaller thing, which is that you spend more time learning the rules and set up and tear down than you do playing? Can you agree? And maybe that's not actually true, right? I was kind of having this thought that, those weird people who just play Go or just play chess or just play Android Netrunner, they may actually be onto something in the sense that they get to spend more time in game playing time. I won't use my bad acronyms again, than not. And that was kind of a mini revelation in my mind to some degree.
But do you think the people who play Go and chess to such an extent are just playing the game and like basically not doing anything else? People who are playing it to that extent are reading about openings and are like generally going to be like into the history of the games that are devoting like so much.
But they don't need to learn new sets of rules, and they don't need to get 7,000 minis out for Mythic Battles Pantheon, which is the thing that springs to my mind. I genuinely spend more time getting out and putting away Mythic Battles Pantheon than I do playing it. And I love that game, but the reason I don't play it very often is because it takes so long to get out and put back.
Sure.
And one of the reasons I got rid of most of my board games, I've only got like 20 board games in my collection now. And one of the reasons...
Really?
Yeah. And one of the reasons was that, well, A, I want to leech off my friends, and I want them to teach me the rules, because I'm fed up of looking at my board game. What shall I play today? No, I won't play that because I have to read the rules again. No, I won't play that. I have to read the rules. So my collection was only, in reality, 20 games big anyway, because they're the only ones I can keep in my head. So I just got rid of any games I don't play because I don't know the rules for. I think, well, I'm never going to want to learn the rules for those, so someone else can teach me them if I want to play them. And so boiled it down to 20 games. 20-ish games. I agree with you, Kellen. I think that is a problem. I don't think it's a solvable problem, but it's certainly an irritant within the hobby as it stands.
I don't know. Kellen and Neelan have spoke about this before, where they feel this like mental weight of owning games because they have to remember the rules, and for me, I don't feel that. I enjoy refreshing the rules. I enjoy teaching rules. I don't have a problem with that. And I think there's an argument to be made that your way of seeing things is probably the healthier way. But again, it feels like almost like a utopian, like idealistic thing that is.
To be fair, Mark,
yeah,
you're one of the oddest people we've ever met.
Fair.
True. Dan, if you ever are in America and you invite Mark somewhere, he'll show up on time, and then within 15 minutes he'll say, I have to go outside, and then he'll go outside, and then he'll never come back. And you'll never see him again for like 2 weeks, and you'll be like, what happened to Mark? And no one will know what happened to Mark, and we still don't know what happened to Mark. We've never been in his house before. Does he have a house?
This is a green screen.
Yeah. He's like the Captain Oates of board gaming, going outside. You probably won't get that not being English. I tell you what, people's going against human nature, that dovetails nicely into mine. If I can go again, can I have another go?
Yeah.
Because this is a complaint about people now, not board games. And it's board gamers airing their dysfunctional relationships on social media. And it winds me up no end. And there's two forms this take. The first one is, how can I force my partner into playing games with me? They don't like it, but I still want to force them to do it, please. What should I do? I was like, well, maybe leave them alone. I don't know. Maybe not force them to do something they don't want to do. The subset of that is, my granddad's just died. What game can I take to my grandma to make her feel better? It's like, I've genuinely seen that on Facebook.
Wow.
I'm just like, what are you doing? Be a human being towards her, not somebody who's desperate to evangelize the hobby. Must grow the hobby. It really frustrates me. The worst one, and this is one that is repeatedly, boringly, so only Facebook really it's ever brought up on, is jokes about hiding their board game purchases from their partner. Now, this winds me up absolutely no end. These people who, all these jokes about sneaking board... A, if it's a problem, stop doing it. It's not something to joke about. It's not healthy. Stop it. B, you should be You should be in a place in your relationship where you're happy to share each other's financial decisions and things like that. If you're going to get told off for spending money and you can afford it, then you're in a dysfunctional relationship. If you're going to be told off because money because you can't afford it as a household, then you are doing something wrong. There's no outcome to that scenario which puts you in a good light. So stop making that bloody joke. Because it's rubbish, and I hate it, and it's always a bit of misogyny with it as well, which really frustrates me. And I could go on at length about people on Facebook and Twitter and the community, this wonderful inclusive community that's desperate to tear itself apart and scratch each other's eyes out that we have. That I thought I'd better not go down that road. And I'll just say the dysfunctional relationships that people are airing on these groups.
It is interesting, Dan. It is interesting because, like, as you were starting to speak, I was starting to think to myself, like, is there any hobby where this is not the case? Like, do camera people say, like, do I have to hide my lenses? And I don't know. But, like, I know for a fact that...
They do.
I'm sure they do.
And knitting people do, because I've seen some of the groups my wife's involved in. They're all about hiding wool from their partners.
But, like, the thing that did strike me about this, I do think that I've seen a disparate proportion of this in the board game community compared to the video game community. Like, I feel like video gamers are tend to, like, okay, this is just my thing. I'm going to keep buying these things. It's entirely my own little indulgence. But there is this idea that board gamers have to involve obviously by the nature of the hobby a little bit, but you have to involve another person in it. And you sort of have to, like, say, oh, this is my little thing, and I hope it's okay. Like, there is this weirdness of this quirk to it that seems at least a little bit board game specific. And I don't know why that is.
I think you're right. I think it's because you need to play a game. So if you want to play...
Yeah.
I've played a few games with my wife. My wife's not really a board gamer. I don't push her into playing it. She occasionally says, do you want to play a board game? In order to, usually, to improve my mood, stop me grumping around and stomping about and stuff like that. And, you know, we played Wingspan last time we played. We played something that we both will enjoy. Castle Burgundy is usually a go-to for us. But it's once every 6 months or so. But I'm not desperate to push her into board gaming. But I do understand that why you might be if you're not able to get that fix from somewhere else. You need a second person, don't you?
I think the physical space also component also, like, adds to a lot of it, where there is just, like, I mean, you know, looking back behind me, like, they're present. So they're like, if you are acquiring them, other people will see them. Unlike, you know, me downloading a game on Steam, like, that is just my little secret to myself and mine alone. Like, you can't help but involve anyone that enters your house in your hobby just by virtue of it being out there in the open. Yeah, there's probably a lot of that to do with it as well.
Yeah, you're definitely making a statement with board.
Yes.
There's not many board gamers who don't have board games in a place where people are going to walk in the house and go, oh, that's
right, exactly.
Interesting.
Yes,
yeah,
exactly.
Our builder kind of went, oh, okay. And that's only, with, as I say, 20 games. But, you know, you get people with 200, 300. It certainly makes a statement about yourself, doesn't it? Having a load of board games on the shelves.
I was hoping that mine wouldn't dovetail with Dan's because I was trying to find some contrary thing, but it unfortunately does dovetail with Dan's. Mine is very specific. There is the idea that people who have analysis paralysis, who take a long time on their turns, it's a sort of a negative, and I get that, and I agree in general. And there's the idea that, you know, if you move faster in the game, it'll make for quicker games, it'll make for a more fun experience. And Mark Bigney, if so very wrong, says, you know, mistakes make the games fun, play faster. That's something he said. I sort of disagree. Look, I don't want people who are playing who are contemplating every sort of, like, nuance of, should I do this for 2 resources or should I do this for 3 resources? That does drive me crazy. I agree there. But also, and I think when it comes to me, I think that I am very cognizant of, like, how people are feeling around the table. So, you know, if there's the idea that we want to get this over with, I'll play faster. But I do like, in certain moments of the game, you know, in certain, like, parts of the game where, like, there's a critical decision, I do like to think it out and consider my options. And that's part of the enjoyment for me of a game. There have been games, and this doesn't happen often, so again, it's a minor gripe, but, like, there have been times where I have rushed turns because I felt like the table wanted to. And again, for the most part, I'm fine with that. But it does make for a lesser experience to me. Like, and that's probably because the competition of the board game is important to me. So if I walk away feeling like, oh, I didn't play well because I was rushed, it just sours the experience to me. So all I'm asking is that people have a perfect sense of how long they should take on turns. That's all. Not too long.
It's reasonable.
Not too short.
It's reasonable.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, there's a balance of selfishness, isn't there, with AP?
Right.
There's the selfishness of somebody who is AP and wants to spend all their time on their turn and things like that. There's also the selfishness of the other players who want it to get to their turn.
Right.
Because that's the enjoyable bit. And so it's working out the perfect level of selfishness that keeps all the table happy, really.
There's like a delicate dynamic to this because like I've played 2-player games with my older brother who doesn't play nearly as many board games with me, and he loves to take an age taking his turn. And like when it's just the two of us, I'll be like, Jay, you've got to speed this up a little bit. But then I always imagine in my head, would I do that if we were playing with anyone else? It's a hard place to find, like, because I don't ever like being the person that's being prodded by someone else in a bigger context of more players at the table, where it's like, okay, come on, keep this going. I'm like, no, I'm going to double down and take longer now. But I think you're right, Mark, that the onus has to be on the person to realize that they're taking longer and like adjust accordingly.
But there should be some give there where, you know, if it's like somebody who derives a lot of their pleasure, and you should know this going in, from the competition,
yeah,
give a little bit of leeway there.
Totally.
Because it may be critical to their enjoyment.
Yeah. Well, I'll just scream in your face and say, come on.
Right.
So,
right.
So yeah,
Perfect.
I don't think we should play a game, to be honest, because I will scream in your face.
I've got practice from Kellen, so we're good.
So I guess it does actually, and this was not intentional, but it does fall to me a little bit to be the combo breaker, because this doesn't really dovetail with anything anyone said, but because I actually think
ruined it.
Yeah, I've totally ruined it. Board games are ruined now. Thank you, Neelan. But I do think this is fairly unique to me, at least I would think among the three of us. Dan, I'm actually not sure on your propensity for storytelling in board games, but I think board games do storytelling badly. And I don't think that this has to be true, because I think tabletop or role-playing games do storytelling extremely well. I do think there are good examples of board games that do storytelling well. Even outside of the idea of like a campaign structure, I genuinely think that something like a social deduction game, like something like a Blood on the Clock Tower, does do this, a good example of like an emergent story happening. And that's just one example of storytelling. But even like more linear scripted games, people talk to like Arkham Horror, for example, as something that does tell a good story over multiple games and does that well. But I often think that sometimes games that are even trying to do good stories just either skimp on like kind of like just the diligence that is required to tell a story effectively, to have an arc, to have meaningful choices, to sort of have reveals structured in a way that isn't just you reading paragraphs of text in between playing a game that's entirely unrelated to the text that you've just read. And again, this is one of those things where video games are largely forced to do this well, so it sort of strikes me a little bit harder, where if you're not integrating story well with your gameplay, it stands out. And I feel like board games just haven't taken that lesson and learned it extremely well.
This is something I've commented on a number of occasions, and I have said on a number of times, board games do not tell stories well and don't do narratives well. And then I went and designed a board game that tells a story and does a narrative. So I've exposed myself as a massive hypocrite.
Expose yourself.
Yeah.
That's not allowed in America.
Well, we do it all the time in England. So I agree with you, actually. I agree with you. I don't think it's necessarily a flaw within each individual board game. I think it's a flaw within board gaming itself. I think the rigid structure of board gaming, and board gaming is about rigid structure and rules and set progression and things like that, compared to the open-ended and creative structure of a role-playing game, for example, means that the role-playing game is always going to be able to do a story much, much better than the board game. And within my game, CoraQuest, there is a story there, but it is set within a rigid structure of the board game, and it wouldn't be a story that I'd expect people to read their kids at bedtime. It's something to hang the game off as opposed to the purpose of the game.
And the thing is that is like, I do agree with you actually conceptually. Like, I do think that board games as a hobby don't necessarily lend themselves the best to this, but I do think that there are really solid examples of where this works well, enough to think that I do think if someone really, really leaned into the idea of building a game around a story, and it's not something I've seen done or even really attempted, at least not to my knowledge, that there could be something there.
Possibly. I mean, probably a more skilled person than me, not to put the CoraQuest down at all. I would argue that Arkham Horror does do it very well. It's the best example of storytelling within the game that I have come across. But I don't think the medium is great for telling stories. And if I want a story, I'd just rather go and play a role-playing game. I don't mind it being there as something to hang the game on, just like a theme is something to hang the game on, but the focus is the game, not the story for me. And that will always be the case with board games. If the focus is the story, I'll play a role-playing game, or, like you say, a computer game. Or a book. You could read a book even. Or even watch a film.
What?
What? We are getting super close to time here, guys. I have like pages and pages of notes. I don't know if you guys only went to 2 points. I'm a little remiss not to just read you the list of all of the that I have.
Do it,
here.
and we'll just disagree with everything.
So I'm going to read you the list. Yeah. So everyone gets one word answer to each bullet point, but you have to go fast. The difference between a board game collector and one who plays board games is way too blurry of a line.
Disagree.
We've kind of... Mark, what?
Disagree. One word answer. Disagree. Let's go. Keep going.
Okay. The amount of playtesting that happens with real live copies of games is crazy town. With balance issues, accessibility problems, we end up with second and third editions of games way too often due to not enough playtesting.
Totally agree.
I have no
Board
idea.
games have gotten radically too expensive.
Agree. That was one of my points. I very much agree.
When final scoring takes way too long or as long as the game itself, there's math at the end of like Awari, Bunny Kingdom. Anytime you have a score sheet, I know that I'm likely in for a bad time.
Disagree. I think score sheets hide the winner and therefore make the game more fun for everybody.
Okay. You have to be on the same wavelength as the other people in your group or otherwise the games don't work. Radically too competitive or way too social.
Agree.
I can see that.
Terrible for your body in comparison to other physical activity hobbies. The hobby is way too sedentary.
Better than taking heroin, though, isn't it? Better than taking heroin.
Takes up one word, Mark. One word.
I started the one word thing, so don't come to me.
It takes up way too much space, and it's bad for the environment. See if you can disagree with that, Mark.
Disagree. What do you want from a board game? What do we?
All right. Why are you on this episode? I cannot stand games where you have to sort of reorient the table or the board or the cards so that everyone can read them. If you have a 4-player game, it just doesn't always work, and people aren't even trying to make it work.
I agree. Actually, one of the original things that led me to my point was this idea that space isn't considered well enough in a lot of board games. Totally agree.
Yeah.
So, Dan, before we wrap, of course, you, the Pigeon Blood Pink Tank, what would you like to plug? You've said CoraQuest 70 times already.
I did not say something. I've been very restrained. Very restrained. I have a number of things I'm involved with in the board game industry, community and industry. I do a podcast with Mike Delisio, Sporadically Board, which is certainly less structured than this and has about 1% of the board game content, and it's a lot longer as well.
Never heard of him.
Well, no, that's fine. That's fine. You've been a guest. You've been a guest. I've also do reviews of kids' games on the Dice Tower. That's relatively sporadically, but I'm going to get back into doing that because my other project has just starting to wrap itself up now, which is I am now a board game designer, to the shock of absolutely everybody, and I've designed a dungeon-crawling game for families. There's not many of those around, called CoraQuest, and that was on Kickstarter, did very well on Kickstarter, much better than I expected, and is going to be published next year, so it should be in shops from kind of end of Q1 next year. But also, if you want a late pledge for it, you can search for CoraQuest, CORA Quest, and it's a game for people to play with children of like 5-6 years old up. A very simple dungeon crawler for all the family. So there you go.
The Kickstarter was so well handled. I don't really follow Kickstarters in general, but I couldn't help but be charmed and just loved how the Kickstarter went. Seeing all like the art being submitted by children around the world, it was just so great and heartwarming. I don't know what it was on your side, on the business side, but from an outsider perspective, it was just so well done.
Not to turn this into a plug for CoraQuest, but it was a game that myself and my daughter created as a lockdown project without thinking about being published, and then it just kind of snowballed, and we got... All the art in the game is done by kids, which is what you're talking about, and then coloured in by our artists. So it looks great, but it's very genuine. And the entire project was very genuine. The entire project was very genuine from the heart, and I think that's what people liked about it.
Absolutely.
And I'm not a businessman. It was all just genuine, a project of love that got put out there, and it's gone amazingly. It's been fantastic. But as I say, I'm not here to plug that, so that's fine.
I pledged it for some... I don't even have kids. I pledged it for Neelan's children.
Oh, thank you very much.
And we all love Sporadically Board. We'll link in our episode description to CoraQuest and potentially the episodes of Sporadically Board that we have been on as a good jumping off point for people. And we will maybe do a Twitter poll if Fandango Tank versus the Blood Pigeon Pink. What is it? Is it Blood Pigeon Pink?
No, Pigeon Blood Pink.
Pigeon Blood Pink? I don't know. Okay. Well, you chose it. And you do you, sir. Thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Board Game Barrage podcast. Thank you, everyone, for listening to the show. You can find us on all forms of social media. You can join our Discord to disagree with why we think that board games suck, but we would also like to hear why you think board games suck.
Yeah.
You can join us on Facebook to discuss that with us. Thank you to Heart Society, as always, for their song, What's on Your Mind, Kid, from their album, Wake the Queens. So long, friends.
Goodbye.
Bye-bye.
And I do not know what Dan is going to tell us about.
I'm going to talk about Marvel Champions. But before I do that, don't I get a colour tank? I've been excited about this.
Oh, my God.